can just leave it on when you hit it the first time. Just make sure all of your cellular devices, other electronics are on silent. And everyone's familiar when you do the roll call to be sure to hit your mic and then turn it off after it, with the exception of you, Ann.
Right. Okay. Give me the high sign when you're ready. Okay. Good morning and welcome, Shumeane. This meeting of the Police Chief Search Committee is called to order. It is 9 a.m. My name is Ann Gill and I am the Director of Human Resources and the Chair of the Police Chief Search Committee. We will start with a roll call to establish a quorum. Lieutenant Mike Capasso.
Present.
Patrol Officer Christine Bork.
Present.
Counselor Jake Wilson.
Present.
Kevin Dickinson.
Present.
Lori Siegel.
Present.
Paula Magnelli.
Present.
Denise Lowers.
Present.
Director Ann Gill, present. With all 8 members of the committee present, we have a quorum. We have convened this morning to facilitate the second round interview for one of the finalists for the police chief position. Throughout the week, finalists will be interviewed publicly, as well as with Mayor Ballantyne. In the coming weeks, Mayor Ballantyne will select from finalists to present before the City Council. There are no votes that are going to be taken in this meeting. The committee will ask each finalist the same questions. Actually, I will be asking the finalists the same questions in the same order. Additionally, each finalist will be afforded the same amount of time for their interview. The finalists will be asked 11 questions, some of which has multiple parts. At the end of the interview, finalists will receive information about the next steps. This morning, the Police Chief Search Committee will conduct a public interview of Mr. Shumeane Benford. Mr. Benford, do you have any questions about the format of this public interview at this time?
Good morning. No, I do not. Thank you.
Thank you. I will begin now with the questions. And question number 1, please begin by briefly telling us about your interest in working for the City of Somerville and how your experiences and skills are a match for the police chief position in Somerville.
Sure. Well, good morning. Thank you very much. Just want to acknowledge the committee on your tremendous work in this space. I do greatly appreciate the opportunity to present and respond to questions this morning and to continue to compete for the opportunity. My interest in the position, looking at the posting, it talks about transformational leadership and looking for a transformational leader. It talks about executive experience. Proven ability to establish strategic planning goals. All those things I've done in my current and past capacities. Gotcha. In my current and past capacities, hopefully that's better. In looking at the position, I believe that I have the requisite skill sets and experiences to meet the moment and look to address the needs and concerns that have been expressed not only by the city, but certainly by the community and what they're looking for in a leader for the 21st century. Certainly, it presents a professional challenge. And you know, as a human being, we endeavor to push ourselves. We endeavor to push ourselves to meet the moment, but also wanting to embrace and take on new challenges and help this community reach its goals with its police executive leadership. As I mentioned, I believe that I do have the professional skill set and experience to meet the moment and to help this community move the agenda forward as it relates to the police department. Very specifically, thinking about 21st century policing and thinking about some of the main tenets of the President's Commission on 21st Century Policing, as well as most recently published documentation around a renewed challenge. We talk about police legitimacy. We talk about accountability. We talk about inclusivity on behalf of all members of the community. It's important that we have a leader that recognizes that fundamentally buys into it, and not only that, has the requisite background and skills to do the work. I am one that don't, certainly as it relates to community policing, this is not about meeting the moment and talking about community policing and neighborhood policing because that is the mantra of the day. This is something that I fundamentally believe in. It is something that I have policed in my entire career, and certainly as a leader, have promoted that throughout. So I do firmly believe that I have the skill set. I believe that I have the requisite body of professional and lived experience to bring that into the role to help move it forward. I would also mention with regards to my management style and being a collaborator and a consensus builder and recognizing all stakeholders. And I've spoken about this in the past and would like to double down and very publicly affirm my position that all stakeholders have a seat at the table in terms of how we move this forward. This includes the police department and its members. It certainly includes the community as the core and helping to set that police agenda. I believe that I have a full body of experience that speaks to that will allow me to come into an organization, work with the various stakeholders, and develop a team and a whole of community approach in terms of how we move forward together in a collaborative way. So I do believe that I have that requisite skill set. I do, and I'm very much interested in the professional challenge, but also looking forward to an opportunity to help move this community forward and this department forward. And again, as I have shared in the past, this is not an indictment on everything that's wrong. It really is an embracement of what can we do better together. So I, am very much encouraged by what I've seen, what I've heard, and what has been publicly disclosed, but certainly look to embrace all of the tremendous work that is already going on, not only in the Somerville Police Department, but in the City of Somerville, particularly as it relates to the Chief of Police position.
Great, thank you. Question number 2. What have you done in your past police leadership positions to promote trust and effective communication between yourself, department members, department heads, residents, business owners, and governmental leaders? Please share examples and what would be your strategy to accomplish this in Somerville.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. So that there are multiple pieces to it, so I may ask for a refresh on it. But I'll certainly start with working with stakeholders internally within the department. Anytime there's new leadership that comes into any organization, there is a curve, there is a transition, and there is trepidation that's experienced by the members. One of the first things is to make sure that the members of the Somerville Police Department recognize and know that they are stakeholders and partners in the work that we're looking to do together. That's one. 2, it really is a team approach. The chief's position really is the appointed position that serves as the visionary and helps move the organization forward. But I am someone that relies on and has lived my professional life and my personal life in not knowing everything about anything. I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to recognize all the different stakeholders and the many gifts that they bring to the table. So it really is finding a way to harness that type of knowledge, that type of willingness, that type of interest, and coming to the table to work towards the center to help us promote and move the department and the community forward. So we would have conversations with our internal stakeholders. We would have regular and candid meetings so that individuals are informed and we're sharing information. Information and conversations can be difficult, and I have never shied away from difficult conversations, particularly if it's the right thing to do. But we will always start from a standpoint of fundamental fairness. Right? And as we start those conversations, it's important about sharing information and establishing benchmarks so that individuals understand what the expectations are, setting realistic expectations, setting benchmarks, acknowledging the various different stakeholders within the police department, not just the individual officers and those employees that make up the department, but also recognizing the unions as stakeholders, recognizing other city organizations and city departments as stakeholders. I fundamentally believe that crime and dysfunction is a social ill. And one of the things that I've tried to do in approaching that is, one, it's always human-centered. We look at individuals and persons as humans first, and by embracing a whole of community approach, it allows us to decentralize that process and looking at crime and dysfunction as not an issue that the police department has to solve on their own. Certainly, when we think about the mandate that the police department has specifically as it relates to public safety and community safety, that is our primary mandate. However, when we think about public safety and community safety in the 21st century, it really is about inclusivity. How can we bring diversity of thought and ideating into the process so that we can solve the issues of the community in a much more robust way? So certainly look to be open and to have those conversations. And when we think about alternative approaches, I am a big proponent of alternative approaches. When we look at the report that was completed as it relates to the citing study, it talked about procedural justice, and it talked about restorative justice, and it talked about all these different models really under the broad-based mantra of community policing. And it really is allowed me to arrive at a place where we look at it from an alternative approach standpoint. How do we blend traditional policing with alternative approaches so that it meets the moment and it meets the level for which we know that the community is demanding for, and we have to do better on in looking at alternative approaches. So when we think about 911, 911, unfortunately, the way we built it out societally, it has become everything, and I apologize, I'm trying to make sure I pivot to address you. But it has become everything to everyone. And we built out a system beginning in the late 60s with 911 where if something happened at 2:30 in the afternoon, you called 911. If something happened at 2:30 in the morning, you called 911. Institutionally, some of the first organized sets of numbers that we learn after we get our primary numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is 911. And what we have done with that is we built out a system where when we have that emergency, you make that call. But when we think about it today, when we think about, unfortunately, things like substance abuse disorder, when we think about mental illness, we know that there is a space, an appropriate space for alternative approaches. Well, when we look at that and we think about how we're going to move that forward, how can we have a conversation with our public health professionals to help us better understand it? When we think about public safety, the police are trained very matter-of-factly. And if you look at and understand police training about the matter-of-fact side of how we train and how we execute our duties, it's not too difficult to realize that we could be on a collision course if we are unable or unwilling to pivot and bring in different stakeholders, whether it be from public health, from our elderly or aged community, from our school department, public works. We can go on down the line around different ways in which we can help inform how we're going to approach this from a whole of community approach standpoint. So when we look at that, I reflect on an opportunity where I sat as part of a body when we looked at the CAHOOTS model. And what we found was when we think about it through a traditional public safety lens, what we know is, generally speaking, when people call 911, it's because all other coping mechanisms have failed. So when we think about police and public safety in general, we're really coming there, identify what the issue is, and render a response. Well, if it's a mental health response that would be appropriate in that moment, that could be a challenge if we're unwilling to look at how are our officers trained, what's our mandate, how are we approaching it, so we can look at the diversity of thought that we have with our various stakeholders and help us understand that better. What can we do better? It was very convenient, and it has been very convenient when City Hall or other departments that are 9 to 5 shut down, in knowing that there is someone to pick up the phone when someone calls and need at 2:30 in the morning. It becomes a challenge when you may be that family or that community on the other end, and it's a mental health or some other challenge that doesn't rise to the level of traditional public safety, where the response, where we need an alternative response. So it would be appropriate to engage those conversations so that we can better understand what can we do better, what alternative approaches can we look at so that we can achieve that goal. You asked very specifically about examples. As it relates to deployment, we talked about, again, in looking at that summary and really trying to delve into the data, it talked about formalizing community policing and alternative approaches as a main staple in how the department moves forward. Well, that's something that I and we have done throughout my career in working with great team players and looking at how do we come up with alternative approaches. So we've looked at alternative approaches, and what we've done is we've identified that there is always going to be a need for traditional policing. While, we endeavor to eliminate crime, again, it's just that we endeavor to do it, and we want to get there, but the reality is we also have to be prepared for the reality that it may happen, and we may need that response. But what we've done is as opposed to that being the only objective, the only sight picture that we align ourselves with, let's look at alternative approaches. So we've looked at and we've interjected and we've started to institutionalize this as right from the interview process with candidates. So we've gone away from simply very standard and strict processes for onboarding individuals and staff and persons to come into the department. We know that how we recruit, the message that we send from day one, really does reflect the type of individuals that we're going to welcome into the organization. So what we've done, in an example of that, and how we've attempted to pivot the mind frame, the thinking in this space is, we have engaged in an opportunity where we have informational sessions where we share very specifically around what the goals and objectives are, the type of candidates that we're looking for, individuals that are willing to buy into this type of alternative model. It's not that we're not going to have to do other types of policing, but the reality is we have to start promoting it from a different standpoint and advertising from a different standpoint that we're looking for this type of individual. The civil service system, it's pretty mundane and it's pretty clear. They advertise, you apply, you take the exam, you rank high enough, and you get selected, right? And it's pretty regimented through the process. What can we do in looking at that process as a department at our level while upholding all of the statutory privileges that come along with it, but having those very candid conversations even before the interview process so that an individual knows transparently, this is the type of organization that you're coming into. These are what the expectations are. We want you to make an informed decision, so we're allotting and availing ourselves to share this information in advance so that you can make an informed decision. And I will say that is start from the top down. I have interviewed candidates on Sunday mornings. I have interviewed candidates late in the evenings, and I've interviewed them on Saturday mornings, right? Because they're candidates that work overnight and don't have the privilege of time off. So we met them where they were at 7:30 in the morning when they got off their tour at 6:30 to promote this. And we've heard from candidates that have said, it's not just the job, it was the personal plea. It was the conversation with leadership that convinced me that we're moving in a different direction, not just literature. So we've tried to institutionalize that in that way. And another quick example that I'll point to is an engagement team model where we're promoting, and we've talked about this, right? We know that the Somerville Police Department, at least through the data and the information in the summary report, there was lots of credit given to the Somerville Police Department for their engagement with the community. But again, they're asking for, how do we formalize this? How do we take this to the next level? So we have looked at institutionally changing our philosophy, looking at our operational model. We have an operational model. We talk about situational awareness. We talk about readiness, but how do we look at this and ensure that community engagement and alternative approaches are just as impactful and just as standing within the organization so that it becomes second nature, that we're not just looking at deployment, we're also looking at how do we ensure that the messaging and what we're expecting day in and day out from officers is promoted. So we've looked at an engagement model. That model allows us to have, starting with those informational sessions that lead into the formal interview, really promoting and really pushing with individuals. There can be no deviation from this. There won't be an opportunity where you will be able to fall back and say that, I wasn't quite sure what I was getting into. We're being clear, we're sharing information, answering the difficult questions, being as transparent as we possibly can so that we're attracting individuals into an organization. And more importantly, as an organization, when we think about what we can do with our operational model and some of the other things that we can do, sending a clear message that this is a high benchmark and this is a priority of the department.
Great, thank you. Question number 3. Please define what community policing means to you and what programs or initiatives have you implemented or overseen to enhance this?
Thank you very much. Community policing. So when we, and I want to respond from an informed standpoint. I also want to respond from a personal standpoint in what it means to me. I don't think it's any secret that I am a black man that sits before you, and I am a man that comes into this very balanced and objective in the approach. And you've heard me say it earlier, and I'll continue to try and reiterate this, that there is room for all cultures, races, and persons at the table for those that are interested in doing the right thing on behalf of human beings. As it relates to community policing, the summary report did a really good job in recognizing that, and alluded to it just a few moments ago, did a really good job in alluding to many different models under community policing. When we think about community policing, and when we think about where we've been and where we've gone, when I talk to my students, I often start out my course by telling them, know your history, or you're bound to repeat it. Right? So I use that as an example to share with young persons and students that stay up on your reading and do these different things, because if you don't, you'll get two chapters behind, and as the semester continues, you'll continue to make that mistake, and ultimately it will catch up with you. Well, we know that that's defensible data. We've seen that with students all over, so we try and use that information to motivate them. Why do I share that experience, and why do I reflect on that? When we think about community policing, I talked about the earliest inceptions of community policing, and this is certainly my interpretation, and there's certainly plenty of literature that supports it, and I think some practice that you'll find that will support it as well. The watch and ward system. It was one of the earliest examples of community policing. And what it said was, we know that as we, fought the war to secede from England, there were lots of lessons that we learned from it in terms of how we wanted to build out our democracy. But what we do know is we bought the ward system, all right? And we have 7 wards here, and we talk about how police are deployed across the different wards in the city, across the shifts. But we had the watch and ward system, and what the expectation was every male member, and today we're much more diverse, so it would be every member of the community, was expected once they attained a certain age to help police and keep watch over the community. That's a really early example of the community being involved in the process for setting the police agenda and establishing tolerance levels for how the community is policed. When we think about community policing and we fast forward, we look at how policing in America has evolved. We're an industrialized nation. We've gone through many iterations. We're a fast-paced society. So the police department has evolved in that way, and over the years, in some instances, we have gotten further and further away from that community-based approach for how we approach policing. Now, we still do that broadly in general, because each community has the ability and the authority under state law to adopt a police department to protect its citizenry. But when we think about the practices that we've employed over the years, that's where the challenges become, because we got further and further away from the community being involved in that process. Fast forward to present day, what we know and what we think about when we think of community policing, it provides alternatives. It gives us an option to break away from that regimented model of we hire officers, we put them in cars or put them in beats or put them in certain locations, and you go out, you respond to calls, and that's the extent of the engagement that we want you to have with the community. We built that model over many years. And now we're seeing, unfortunately, that model is not the most effective model, particularly when we think about disenfranchised communities or marginalized communities. So when we think, ma'am, about community policing, it really is about providing options. And I mentioned it earlier, we will always have to have a posture and a readiness to respond to the unknown and the unforeseen. And I would like to think that any of us, while we're laying our heads in bed at night in the sanctity of our homes, rest a tad bit assured knowing that there is someone that is protecting you or available to protect you when you're in your most vulnerable state. So when we think about community policing, it allows us to look at a decentralized model where the police don't have to solve every issue, A, and B, it gives us the opportunity to welcome in diversity of thought and alternative approaches into the model. So when we look at that, every day that we think about how it is that we're going to go about doing our work, how we're going to engage the community, that is what drives me. That's what motivates me when I think about my lived experiences, when I think about the challenges that I've had coming up as a young man in policing, having to work alongside police officers that I had adverse experiences with as a young man growing up. All of these different things help to drive my lived experience and what I hope to bring into this role and what helps to drive the thinking around community policing. And to wrap up, at its core, community policing is about engaging the community, recognizing that the community is the core of the work that we do in service to the community, A, and B, knowing that community policing gives us the opportunity and the options to look at alternative approaches into how we go about service delivery.
Great, thank you. Next question is question number 4 of the 11, the total of 11. The chief of police will be required to interact with constituents, city staff, and elected officials in situations that may be unfavorable. What tools would you use to help navigate these situations while still fostering positive engagement?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the question. Right, the position is a high-ranking position within city government. There is an expectation that the incumbent that occupies the position has the requisite skills and experience to interact with not only city leadership, but elected officials across the board, to interact with peers and other leaders within city government, nonprofit, the private sector, as well as, again, at the core of the community. How do we go about doing that? As we talk about and think about some of the work that I've been part of, and again, with many team members that are very talented in helping us to attain those goals and objectives, when we think about engagement, you know, there is an expectation that when we're talking about wholesale change and approach, there is an expectation that people want to hear from and engage with leadership. There is an expectation that people want to know that as we talk about leading up and leading down and leading sideways, that the organization and the leadership really does believe in the philosophy and what they're asking subordinates and others to do. So one of the things that I pride myself on and will continue to do is I attend many of these meetings. Now, I don't have the bandwidth to get to them all, but certainly in engaging those conversations, it's extremely important to open up that dialogue with the executive decision makers that really have the ability through process and through policy to implement many of the things that's being promoted. So the first thing is to start with personal engagement with these various stakeholders. Secondly, you'll hear me mention it, and it's because I believe in it, transparency and accountability. I believe in accountability, and accountability starts with me first. I am accountable to the constituents, and we expect that every level within the organization is accountable. As a leader, I fully recognize that you can lead from the top, but if you can't get those at the operational and the frontline level within the organization to do the work, it's not going to work. And vice versa. If at the bottom of the organization there isn't a level of confidence in top leadership, they're going to be unmotivated to do the work. So it's extremely important, which is why I recognize the police department and the men and women that do the work and all the persons within the police department that do the work, that we recognize them as a stakeholder that needs to be engaged. With regards to the broader community, they too have to be engaged at that level. So we would have transparent and open conversations, being held accountable, being clear with what we're expecting. We can have differences. We don't have to agree on everything, but we should respect our positions as we come to the table and understand that when we're engaging in these conversations, it's really about compromise on behalf of the greater good. Right? When we talk about that's what makes this society, our society, so dynamic. It's not one-sided. It's a society that's built on the opportunity for everyone to be able to buy, bless you, for everyone to be able to buy in, and for all of us to be able to come up with compromise that ensures that we create an environment that all can thrive, an environment that all can feel comfortable in, and one for which we know that even when the conversations are difficult, we can come to the conversation and have that discussion because we know at the core it is human-centered approach where we want to ensure that each and every member of our community, to include our civil workers, to include our community members, as well as our business and nonprofit sector, that they all feel and know that they are part of the process and part of the conversation moving forward. So in closing, it starts at the top, having those candid one-on-one conversations, meeting with our elected officials, getting and obtaining the vision of the mayor, and incorporating that into the work that we do every day, and also engaging individuals that may be our advocates, that may be our adversaries, and engaging conversation and recognizing the value of what they're saying and bringing them into the conversation so that we can make compromise.
Great, thank you. Question number 5. What tools did you find most effective in increasing employee engagement and job performance? And how do you create an environment that fosters positive morale?
Thank you very much for the question. In looking at the summary report, again, I shared this in other forums, the police department, and I'll focus my comment and response with regards to the Somerville Police Department and the men and women and persons that work within there, and thinking about what was shared in that summary report. And again, I recognize it's a summary report, but I also recognize that a host of different stakeholders were consulted to include them, and it was disheartening to see that they feel unsupported, that there is a lack of morale. Those are very strong positions. Those can be very challenging to overcome. And the first position that I start with is I come in here, as I mentioned, human-centered approach. I come in trying to do the right thing, and I wake up every day with that as my goal and objective. One, recognizing the officers, recognizing the persons that do the work day in and day out, ensuring that they know their value, ensuring that they know and are part of the successes, sharing with them where it is, the vision, and where we're looking to go, leading by example, mentoring, looking at individuals, thinking about successor planning. We all have a timestamp, to include myself, right? And this is not about building systems and building infrastructures that revolve around Shumeane or that revolve around a certain or small core of individuals. It's about institutionalizing change so that it can survive Shumeane, so that individuals that come in behind us can pick up on it and move it forward, can manipulate it in a way that meets the moment and allows the department and allows our policies and practices to remain relevant. Engaging in regular informational sharing with those individuals, having candid and open conversations. So I have and have consistently throughout my management experience have engaged a regular cadence of meetings. And sometimes the meetings are 15 minutes, sometimes the meetings are an hour and a half long. But we engage in those conversations to ensure that we're sharing information, but most importantly, ensuring that there is a venue and a theater for all levels within the organization to be heard. So there is a conversation for frontline staff. There is a conversation for frontline supervisors. There is a conversation for mid-level and senior-level management, so ensuring that we have that cadence consistently. And lastly, one of the things that I've done is, at this level, there are meetings, there are conversations. We all have a role, which is why I talked about that paradigm and leading from the top down and being a confident leader so that those that are charged with doing the work go and do the work and are willing to do the work voluntarily without micromanagement, because there are times when I'm just not going to be able to go to every call. Right? It's not what my mandate is. I have to have the confidence in those individuals to do the work, and most importantly, they're motivated to do the work. I mention that because while we have different options and different ways in which we can look at how do we invest in staff, how do we look at successor planning, how do we open up doors for inclusion and equity for women and people of color within the organization, how do we do those things and go to the meetings and ensure personal relief time. There's only so much time in the day, so we've looked at what other options do we have where we can ensure that the conversation remains open and individuals can buy in. So I have done in the past, again with a great team, is we have stood up several volunteer committees, one of them being an innovation committee, one of them being a training committee, and this allows for, and we've asked officers and we've had personal conversations with them, share and be part of the conversation. So when there are trainings, when there are different opportunities, where there may be pathways to work with other departments, when those opportunities come up, if we don't have a sight picture on them, it would be nice to ensure that you have a voice to be able to share that with us so that we can take it into account. So really relying on and looking at different ways in which we can open up pathways for all members of the organization to be part of the solution, to be part of how we think about We're going to invest because successor planning is important. We talk about mentorship. We talk about identifying leaders, being able to move leaders forward. If we don't create pathways and venues for them to be able to share it in a competent and in a confident and comfortable way, there is going to be a gray area. So we've done some of those things. It's been successful. We've been able to train some individuals. We've been able to promote women. We've been able to open up pathways for other individuals that maybe those pathways would not have been open, but not for the opportunity to be part of the conversation.
Great, thank you. Question number 6. In your opinion, what is the biggest challenge facing law enforcement agencies today? And in your opinion, what's the biggest challenge facing the Somerville Police Department? And how would you propose to handle the challenges?
Thank you. Greatly appreciate the question. Policing, recruiting is an issue. We talked about, and I mentioned earlier, about making this a department that people want to come to, that people seek out. It's about us resetting the narrative for the department and how we advertise and promote to those individuals. Because recruiting is, by way of staffing, right? There are a host of different issues that we all have to speak to as police leaders in the discipline. But recruiting is the #1 issue as it relates to staffing that every department, across this country, quite frankly, but to speak more specifically, I've been in conversations as recently as earlier this week around challenges around recruiting. A nod to my brothers and sisters and persons that work in the fire service. They don't have quite the issues that we have. But on the police side of the house, we have some very real issues with recruiting. As it relates to recruiting, I will tell you that some of it is self-inflicted with the work that we've done and how we've done it. And again, I've talked about policing being a noble profession, but we have to return that position and this discipline to that nobility through a dignified response, and it's recognizing some of these issues and what we have to do better. So recruiting is a huge issue, and that has multiple layers. Women, people of color, other emerging, communities within our society. It is a broad-based issue, and we're looking to have conversations. We're talking to each other. We're being more innovative with how we recruit. We're having conversations about incentives, but at the core, it has to be that individuals want to serve in a particular organization, and we have to do the work to make it attractive. Retention. Holding on to individuals, individuals that want to stay here, individuals that don't get to the end of their career and want to scream and run out of the door because they're so frustrated, but maybe engaging in the conversation and looking at different approaches so that individuals that have greater time left in service would be interested in staying. So we need to think about retention. We're seeing at I would stop short of saying alarming rates, but I would say certainly that it is notable individuals that are leaving the profession earlier, individuals that are coming into the profession and looking at other opportunities and walking away. This was not the case 20-plus years ago. We had thousands of people on the civil service list. We've had instances in recent years where the state has had to give multiple exams in a year. And I suspect that folks that work and do the work in recruiting within the city and the police department here know those challenges, not just in policing, but across multiple disciplines. But as it relates to policing specifically, we don't have quite that depth. We have to work harder. We have to do better. We have to have those conversations, which is why there is no work that's above or beneath me, which is why I was willing and am willing to show up at the 7:30 conversations with prospective candidates to have those conversations. Community trust. Again, we have to do better. When we think about some examples of some of the areas that we went wrong, and this is not to suggest, this is not an indictment on the Somerville Police Department, but more a reflection on policing as a whole. Because we're a much more connected society, what happens in Minneapolis affects us on Broadway Street here. What happens in Dorchester or other communities with marginalized communities impacts us here. So when we think about trust, when we think about the 80s and the war on drugs, we're still dealing with individuals that are raising families that were impacted. We were treating drug dealers and substance abuse, so those suffering from substance abuse disorder the same way. We know that when we think about sentencing from that period, we know that it was disproportionate. The data is clear, and I can't recite it here, but the data is crystal clear that certain communities were disproportionately impacted by sentencing. We also know that economically, when you're economically challenged, in many cases, it transcends race and gender. When you don't have, you don't have. So we also know that our disenfranchised, economically disadvantaged communities were adversely impacted by that policy. When we think about stop and frisk, aging myself just a little bit, don't hear it as much these days, but nonetheless, if you talk to persons that are black and brown, they will talk about that. They will have an example of it. They will be able to reflect upon it. I think about my own experiences. I think about as a police officer when I moved through the community. I think about as a black man, as a man of color, when I moved through the community, the different reception because I'm attached to policing. I know that there is a challenge there, and I know that we can do better. So community trust, we owe it to the community that we serve. I talked about very earlier on about the watch and ward system and the building of policing and community policing. We've gotten away from that. There are some conversations that we don't have in certain communities. There are conversations that we're intimidated to have in certain communities, and yes, they can be difficult, but we have to have them, so community trust. I would also talk about mental illness. Mental illness and wellness within policing, this is a priority, period. One, with our approach, we have to look at alternative approaches. There was an example of an unfortunate officer-involved shooting, not in this state, another state. It was an individual that suffered from a disability within that community, and this goes back to some of the lessons that we learned from the conversations that we were having about the CAHOOTS model, where we asking the right questions. A 911 dispatcher or a 911 call taker, some of the first questions, if not the only questions that we ask: what's your emergency, what's your location? Why? Because all coping mechanisms have broken down. We want to get police to the scene as quickly as we can. But if you're a clinician or if you're a practitioner, you may ask an entirely different set of questions. It might be, what is your crisis? Have you taken anything? So what we learned from that model, we knew that perhaps there has to be an investment in training. Perhaps there has to be an investment in the approach, because the public safety approach is much more matter of fact. The clinical, the public health approach, the crisis-driven approach outside of public safety may be very different. So when we talk about wellness, when we talk about alternatives, this is what we're talking. We recognize, we hear about these mass shootings. They've become far too commonplace. We hear about them on the news, whether it's the 6 o'clock, the 5 o'clock, 'cause it's a 24 hours news cycle now, right? So regardless of what time you see it, oftentimes we hear it and we move right past it. 10 years ago, we were outraged by it. We looked at it. We were locked into the TV. And what we know now is it's happening, unfortunately, much more too often. And we're finding that mental illness is often a factor in this. So looking at our approach to mental illness and how we deliver services to the community, A. B, within the profession. I came up during a time in the profession where you didn't talk about it. Now, in the academy, they gave us the stats. They talked and told us that many are going to be divorced, right? They talk about officer suicide, but we didn't deeply delve into mental illness and what can we do to support the officer before we get to that point. You cannot go to these calls year after year, day after day, seeing people at their lowest, at their most vulnerable, and it not get parked here. And it comes out at these times when the officer is in the most critical life or death situation, or comes out at the time where it's a seemingly innocuous engagement with the community, but a word is said that's a trigger, and 30 years gets dumped out on the community. We have to find a way to do better by our officers. Mental illness, wellness, divorce, it's not acceptable. We don't have all the answers, which is why public health, I am more than willing to sit down, which is why I'm more than willing to hear from individuals. I will tell you that, this conversation when I mentioned about everyone having a seat at the table, that is Shumeane speaking in his rawest forms. I have had custodians, I have had the lowest individuals by title in their organizations give me the greatest help that I have received in being able to achieve. There is no success that I've achieved that's attributed to everything that I've done right. Lots of individuals, whether I knew it or whether I didn't, that helped me along the way. And that is something that I have doubled down on. I start every one of my meetings with and end with mental illness, making sure that they know about employee assistance programs, making sure that they know about, I take the call at 2:30 in the morning when it's a major incident. It would be an honor to take the call if you're in crisis at 2:30 in the morning, and I can help you. So officer wellness and mental illness, that would round up my response with regards to priorities facing the profession and doubling down on what can we do better.
Thank you. Next question, number 7. What police initiatives would you implement to address the needs of an underserved community?
Thank you for the question. So if I could, I'd like to focus on something that I read over and over on and prepared notes on and thought about as it relates to the summary report, and I talked about it earlier, and I mentioned it earlier to some in another audience, around formalizing community engagement. And it recognized, and that's why, I want to make sure that I speak directly to this city and the police department that you are valued and you are doing the work. It would be unfair for my comments, and oftentimes when you compete in these positions, it comes across as though it's an indictment against everything that's wrong, right? This is a conversation about how can we improve, what can we do better, recognizing different challenges. So when we think about this report, it talked about community policing is being done informally by this department and these officers every day. I looked at the mission statement and I looked at the objectives. They're quite clear and well written, quite frankly. And it talks about all the things that is going on and all the things that a department would want to do to be relevant and effective in the 21st century. But it also talks about formalizing these processes. And that's what I was alluding to earlier. If you talk any police department, the report talks about it as well, right? The backbone of any police department is the patrol force, the uniformed force. Certainly from my standpoint, anyone that has a different position is off-kilter. We have to have officers that's available to take calls for service. We have to have officers that are available to respond to accidents. They are the backbone of any department. And as a result of that, we have prioritized the operational side of the house, which we should. We're operational, we're a response department. Calls for service, full-time positions, being fully staffed are always going to dominate the conversation because of how we built out the departments. But I believe that there is an opportunity in looking at what's been identified here, and what I believe I'm hearing and seeing is a call to action by the community. We want to drill down. We want to have this alternative and this different conversation. I believe that there's a tremendous opportunity to formalize community engagement in neighborhood and community policing as an institutional mainstay in how the department does business, meaning when we're having the conversation around operating capacity and deployment, community policing has the same organizational influence at the table and around, if we're talking about doing this, this is the other priority, this is the other priority, and as we engage the conversation, they all have to be co-equals in the conversation. I believe that there's a tremendous opportunity here to rethink. When we look at community policing, I looked at it exists right now. There are community positions, some that are not filled because of understaffing on the uniform side. There's recommendations in there talking about, which is a real nod to not eliminating positions, but maybe repurposing positions to help us meet what the recommendations are. But there is a tremendous opportunity in looking at where these different positions report. They're on different sides of the house. They both talk about community. It's not entirely clear to me while they're not co-located or what the overlap is, but I think that there's a tremendous opportunity here for us to look at community policing and engagement when we think about that formalization that the summary is talking about, with elevating that to a command position so that, again, it has the requisite standing in the conversation. When something is elevated at the command position, it sends a very clear and articulate message that it is a priority. And two, you have a senior level executive within a department that is willing and has the charge with advocating at the table and ensuring that community policing and the principles and goals that we're looking to meet there are equally in the conversation as a commander that runs the operational side of the house is advocating at the table. So I think that there's a tremendous opportunity here to look at that. The summary talks about that. I think it is an organizational priority, but I think that that is a potential enhancement to help us get there with regards to formalizing it.
Great, thank you very much. Question number 8. If selected to be the chief of police, how would you ensure that the values of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility are actionable principles that inform the ways members of the Somerville Police Department interact with the community?
Thank you. I greatly appreciate it. One is engaging those communities sends the clearest message that we're committed to it. If we only go into certain communities when there's a 911 call, we failed. And that community, it could be the religious community. It could be a marginalized community. If we're only going in when something is wrong, we have failed. So one, it's engaging those communities with the same vigor and the same commitment that we engage communities around the city. When we think about, I remember Assembly Row when Kmart was over there. And when we think about what's going on over there, I'd have to think from a development standpoint that it's a major priority from a business standpoint and a major anchor for the future of this city. Not to speak out of school on it, but when we think about tax base, when we think about businesses that draw individuals into our communities, when we think about what that means for our small businesses, when we have people that come into our communities and stop at our gas stations and stop at our local establishments, that those are priorities. And when we think about and we talk about engaging those communities, it can't be that the only time, again, that we engage and have those conversations is when we go in, because usually when we go in, we'll go in with a very locked mindset. Remember, we're going in because someone called 911, all else has failed, and we're here to solve the issue for you. It would be extremely helpful if we're able to engage the conversation and maybe even engage some of the community issue and understand some of the community issues beforehand. And I've talked about responding to calls many years ago when I went into a particular community that had a very different cultural background than my own, and we couldn't understand why they wouldn't talk to us. And it was culturally, there was sort of a pecking order within their culture. And in talking to different individuals, it was, if you have a conversation with this senior member in the home, that will open up and allow others to engage the conversation. So one, doing the proactive work on the front end, I find it alarming. When we started on the heels, the unfortunate death of George Floyd and others, it was staggering to me that I was engaged in conversations with police professionals and others around, well, what do we do? And I was somewhat stunned as a man. It's, how about talk to me? Let's engage a conversation so that we can be proactive. When we are proactive, what that does for us, it allows the community to be a partner. It allows the community to be a proactive and third-party advocate for the work that we're doing. So one, it's engaging the community early on. Two, within the department, we have to recognize that we have to do better around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think with my lived experience and my embodiment as a human being, I think I am a symbolic message of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's not good enough. What about practice? What about how do we look at what are the barriers to women and persons of color succeeding? And equity and equality are two different things, right? And I'm sure that, when President Obama got elected, I remember someone saying, okay, everything is equal, affirmative action can go away, right? Equity and equality are very different. How do we come up with equitable practices? Because it's insufficient to recognize the deficiency on one side that's impacting one community or one stakeholder within our organization, but disenfranchises another. So we have to look at the process and say, okay, we know that this process has been level and it's been effective for a segment of our department. We don't want to alienate that. How do we build on that so the other side, where it hasn't been as equitable, can also be part of the process and can benefit from it? So we know that we can do better. Again, the summary report talks about women and persons of color. The summary report also talks about looking at the assignment process to specialized units, and I recognize that there is a conversation that has to be had with unions and others in that conversation. But we should have that conversation to ensure that the most prized opportunities, by way of specialized assignments, it is equitable. Right? There are times when difficult decisions have to be made, and that this person is the right person for that position, and here's why. But when we're talking about to open in a competitive process, more importantly, a sustainable process, we have to be willing to look at it, and we have to be willing to own it and know that we haven't done as well a job as we could as it relates to some of the marginalized groups within the Department of Color, as well as women, in providing those pathways. And one of them would be to start and open up the conversation, understand, Ms. Gill, maybe from your standpoint and your subject matter expertise in HR, around how can we have that conversation in a way that doesn't create a grievable offense? How do we do it in a way so that it's inclusive of all of the different stakeholders? How do we do it in a way that doesn't alienate one side of the house as we're looking to empower another side of the house? We want this to be equitable across the board, so it's having those conversations, and there are tremendous ideas and thoughts that come out of the very people that are impacted on both sides. So again, ensuring that there is a pathway for all stakeholders to be part of the conversation, the officers to be included in that, but certainly looking at the internal process, look at our policy, look at our practices to ensure, in fact, that they are equitable and does give opportunity to everyone in the organization.
Thank you. Question number 9. Now that you've had the opportunity to learn more about the City of Somerville through your research and first-round interview with the Police Chief Search Committee, we ask that you speak to the following 2 things. 1, what is one area you believe you will excel as Chief of Police based on your skills and experience? And 2, what is one area you would like to develop further as the Chief of Police?
Thank you for the question. I believe that my human-centered approach would be helpful for me. I believe that as I go out and do the work, I have been successful in being able to engage with various different stakeholders throughout our community. I believe that I can have a conversation with many different groups. It's not always the easiest conversation, but most certainly willing to have the conversation. So I do believe that I will be able to excel at interpersonal relations and building relationships with persons. I have a lived experience as we talk about some of these different challenges that we think about. I have lived experience with some of the same challenges that we are facing, and I would like to think that my lived experience could provide me with perspective to help address some of the issues that we're hearing from the department. I would like to use those opportunities to be a support mechanism, not only for the agenda that we're looking to promote for the department and for the city, but also an opportunity to create pathways and inroads for our department. Because I don't have a particular cultural or racial background doesn't mean that I can't police in certain neighborhoods effectively, impartially, and fairly. And I hope that my experiences will be able to provide me with a platform to be able to shepherd the department into some of those areas so that we can work towards that greater picture of common and universal good for everyone. I think that I could excel in that role, but I also believe that the department could excel in that space in being able to open up some what may have been very difficult dialogue in the past. We can use this as an opportunity, and then certainly use my leadership as an opportunity to make inroads within those communities. When we think about, the 7 C's, right? Reliability, trustworthiness. I think about my children, and I have a blended family of 5 children with 1 son. And when I raised my children, particularly my son, we used to, shadow box and do all those things that we would do. But I would also say, I'm going to hit you, I'm going to hit you, I'm going to hit you. And most people get locked into physically hitting. That was around honesty, that was around integrity, and that was around trust. And I was trying to impart upon him at a very early age that if you lose any one of those 3, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to navigate with individuals wanting to work with you. So I have lived my life in that way of being able to walk in honestly, being able to walk in with a general level of trust, and having integrity. There are times when we'll have to have difficult conversations where I won't be able to share everything. I won't lie to you, but I won't be able to share everything. Persons can appreciate that if you're honest and transparent with them. And I've tried to develop, and I've lived my personal life that way, and I've tried to develop a professional portfolio that relies on that. And it was validated for me at the lowest level a couple of days ago in a private conversation where an individual said to me, they call me Shuby affectionately, short for Shumeane, my last name Benford. And he said to me, in this conversation, you're the only one that has credibility with all of the stakeholders. And it wasn't that the conversation wouldn't continue. There was a piece that I didn't think I needed to be at the table on. And in his strategy and in his thinking, you can be helpful when we think of the whole of community approach. While you may not need to be the lead, you can be helpful in this discussion. So I hope to be able to rely on character. I hope to be able to rely on competence, being conscious, being present, being an effective communicator, and most importantly, having the courage to engage the conversation. So I hope to be able to use that. As it relates to the department and what can we further develop, I hope to take a hard look at our rules and policies, having a conversation with the different stakeholders. I said earlier, I don't know everything about anything. There is a curve that will have to be learned within this department. There will have to be a reliance on individuals that have institutional knowledge within this department to help guide where we're looking to go. I think that I could come in and provide some vision, provide the strategic vision that we need to be able to move it forward, but there are other individuals that need and will be brought into the conversation, particularly around policy and practice. Do we have policy and practice that, while well-intentioned, is serving as the barriers to progress? So let's look at these policies, let's look at these practices to see if there are ways in which we can make them more spirited in a way that helps us attain the objectives. And I do believe that my strategic vision, my experience as a reformer, I've never walked into any department that didn't have deep-rooted issues. I am a classic reformist, and I am a classic change agent in serving in departments that have had challenges and have worked hard to develop policy to bring them forward. So I would look very specifically, again, within the department to take a look at policy and practice, to look at how do we improve them to meet the moment, to meet the goals and objectives in terms of where we want to be in 21st century policing and being the most desirable place for individuals to want to work. Most importantly, to become the narrative for other departments and the model for other departments to follow.
Thank you. The next to last question of 10, what are some initiatives you intend to prioritize if awarded the role of Chief of Police? And please explain why you chose these initiatives.
Sure. Initially, one of the things I would look to prioritize is, and I've done this in the past, is to engage in conversations and meetings with various stakeholders across the city, both internally and externally. It's important for the department to hear from me very clearly on what the vision is and where we're looking to go. So I would look to have a conversation with all levels within the organization to include the advocates on behalf of the officers and supervisors, namely the unions. I would also look to have very specific and deliberate conversations with elected officials, driven by my conversation first and foremost with the mayor and articulating her vision into the conversation, but a conversation with the elected officials to ensure that they know that there is a voice and there is a conversation to be had on both aisles of the political spectrum, but also in making sure that we recognize as a representative of the people and the work that they do, that there is an opportunity and an ongoing conversation to be had about how we can work collaboratively. Thirdly, the community. Working with and relying on individuals within the department that have done this work in the past, how to and help me get access to the community organizations and the community advocates to start the conversation. It's very easily, again, one of the things my mother used to always say to me, the years go by quick when you get older. Time waits for nobody. It's very quick to lose a year just sort of getting your feet situated, and that is valuable time that's lost. So I would prioritize having those conversations with the community early on. Secondly, I would identify a 100 or a six-month strategy and agenda of things that we want to accomplish in that period. These are some of the things that would go into it. There are others that will go into it. But identifying a strategic plan. This summary is extremely helpful. It certainly gives a dynamic framework for engaging the conversation, but it doesn't provide the strategic plan for how we're going to get there. It is a framework for the conversation. Well done. A nod to the city for investing in this space. But bless you. But we also have to identify a roadmap and a strategic plan to get there. So I would look to have a conversation with the mayor first and others around how do we invest in a conversation around a strategic plan so that we have a roadmap, so that these don't become talking points, so that a binder doesn't get put on the shelf and we're revisiting the conversation in 2 years. It really is around how do we go ahead and engage the conversation and make these things actionable that we're hearing about, as well as other things. So I would look to have those conversations very early on, in addition to working to establish a strategic plan so that we have a blueprint and a roadmap for how we're going to go about institutionalizing policy, making change, and repositioning this department or enhancing this department's role and effectiveness in 21st century policing.
Thank you. Number 11, which is the last question. What resources or programs would you prioritize investing in as chief of police?
A couple things. One, our youth. I spoke with Chief Chuck Ramsey. He was the chairperson of the President's Commission on 21st Century Policing, and I happened to be in a fireside chat, and he talked about the 6 pillars, and he talked about how the 6 pillars were aligned, and the very first pillar was the only pillar, the first and the 6th pillar were the only 2 pillars that were strategically placed, and the first one was building trust and legitimacy with the community. The committee recognized that was a barrier and a major fracture. And when we think about that police and legitimacy within the community, one, that has to be a priority, but engaging with our youth. How do we engage with our youth to better understand them? How do we engage with our youth so that we have policy and practices that speak, they're the future, right? I just moments ago spoke about time waits for no one. We're no longer in a stage where we can look at the different generations that are coming into our professional space and looking at them and go, I don't understand this. At this point, those generations are firmly seated. And it's that thinking that is going to carry us into the 21st century. So how do we engage conversations with our youth to attract them to the discipline, but also understand that they are our future professionals and our future community leaders, our future family members, our future business owners. So prioritize and engage in that conversation with youth. And I'm not entirely clear on what that looks like, but this is why this whole of community approach is extremely helpful, because we can rely on the school department and we can rely on others that work in this space and that are subject matter experts to partner with and understand, how do we move that forward. Secondly, with regards to staff within a department, it's identifying future leaders. It's identifying how do we invest in successor planning. How do we look at appropriate redundancy? How do we look at ensuring that we have policies and practices that survive leaders, that survive individuals, institutionalizing this change? I've been around long enough, I've seen long enough where some things are do as I say in the moment, but because we haven't codified that, because we haven't made that institutionalized within the organization, it falls off the minute that individual is removed, even if in some instances, I've seen it where some things have been absolutely successful. But because I don't fundamentally align with you, the first opportunity I get, the first opportunity I receive, we dismantle a program, even though it was effective. It's really around let's institutionalize this, ensuring that we're mentoring, that we're supporting, and we're bringing on and investing in individuals that buy into it, that want to see the department succeed in perpetuity, that want to recognize the challenges, the issues, and concerns that people bring to us, and knowing that we are here to service them, and recognizing that we have to do better. We've done tremendous work. We do good work every day, but we have to do better. There is a call to action. We're hearing from the community. We're seeing a social trend in a different approach to how we're going to deliver policing in the 21st century, and we have to be willing to not only meet the moment, but ensure that we have a sustainable platform and a sustainable base to be able to do this work into the future.
Thank you, Mr. Benford. And at this time, for questions that you may have of the committee, I'll ask you to send those questions to me by email.
Of course.
And I can get you answers. I can consult with the committee if there's answers that I don't have. And also, you're going to have ample opportunity to have a conversation with the mayor, and she can answer a lot of your questions as well. So thank you for your time today,
Sure.
Mr. Benford, we appreciate it. As for next steps, the community will be able to view the recordings of all 3 finalist interviews this evening. We invite the community to watch each interview and share their feedback with the mayor by responding to the community feedback form after watching each interview. The community feedback form, as well as the interview recordings, will be available this evening. The community feedback form will remain open for the responses through Thursday, May 16th at 12 p.m. For more information about the police chief search, please visit www.somervillemass.gov/police-chief. We have concluded the second finalist interview and will be recessing until the third interview. On the motion to recess, all in favor say aye.
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 All opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the committee is in recess until 11 a.m. Thank you.